She smiled like a queen, toasted herself louder than the bride, and laughed at me from across the ballroom, until the legal clause buried years ago detonated beneath her feet. Before we begin, please subscribe, and I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? The first face I saw when I walked into the reception hall wasn't my daughter's. It was Vanessa's, lit up under the glow of the chandeliers, standing at the top of the staircase as though she owned every square inch of the room. She was wrapped in champagne silk that shimmered under the camera flashes, her arm locked with Gregory Stanton's as if they had been together for decades instead of mere weeks. The applause and laughter weren't for the bride and groom. They were for her. I froze halfway through the door, my breath catching in my throat. It was supposed to be my daughter's night, her moment of joy, but Vanessa had managed to tilt the spotlight onto herself like she always did. She didn't smile at me. No warmth, no pretense. Just that tight smirk she had perfected over the years. The one that said, "I've already beaten you, and now everyone gets to see it too." I had seen that look before. Years back at a charity gala, she had brushed past me toward the mayor's wife, making sure I noticed her laugh ring out across the hall. She hadn't even bothered to hide her disdain when she whispered later that night, "Stay at the back, Ethan. You don't belong with the people who matter." I remember swallowing those words like glass, burying them deep. Tonight, standing under the crystal light of the country club ballroom, I knew she was about to pull the same cruel trick. A young usher in a tuxedo appeared, a polite mask on his face as he handed me a card. My name was scrawled in Vanessa's familiar handwriting, sharp and impatient. He didn't say a word, just gestured toward the farthest corner of the hall. I followed the direction of his hand and saw it immediately. A small table tucked behind a column, shoved next to the swinging doors that led into the kitchen, the corner seat. The message couldn't have been clearer. I clenched the card between my fingers and walked across the room, weaving through tables decorated with roses I hadn't been asked to pay for, past waiters balancing trays of sparkling champagne I hadn't chosen, past relatives who barely looked up as I passed. Their laughter swelled as they talked about the bride's dress, the music, the luxury of it all. From where I was sent, I couldn't even see the head table clearly. The pillar blocked half the view, leaving me with slivers of Vanessa's posture, the curve of her shoulders as she leaned toward her friends. I sat down, alone. The chair wobbled slightly, the cushions sagging, as if even the furniture had been chosen to remind me of my place. My eyes drifted to the string quartet at the front, the violin bows catching the light. Music soared through the room, elegant, sweeping. But from my corner it sounded muffled, drowned by the clatter of dishes swinging out from the kitchen doors behind me. I folded my hands on the white tablecloth, tracing the faint stain someone had tried to scrub away. My water glass was already half empty, condensation dripping onto the linen. A server breezed past without so much as a glance. Every so often I felt her eyes on me. Vanessa, from the head table, laughing too loudly, turning her head just enough to lock eyes with me across the crowded room. And every time she did, she added that half-smile, like a punctuation mark. It was deliberate. This was her stage, and I was her exhibit, the forgotten man in the shadows. I tried to keep my gaze steady, fixed on the edge of the table, but in the reflection of a silver serving tray carried by a waiter, I caught sight of her. She leaned into Gregory, whispered something that made him laugh, then turned just enough for me to see the pride in her expression. For years, I had endured these little humiliations. At first, during our marriage, they had been subtle digs. "Why don't you let me handle the finances, Ethan? You wouldn't understand the details." Later, they became sharper, crueler. "Do you ever think you could have been more? Maybe if you'd had a little ambition." And now, divorced, she had found the ultimate way to drive the knife deeper, by turning our daughter's wedding into her coronation. I let my gaze wander across the room, careful not to meet my daughter's eyes. This was her day. I refused to let my bitterness poison it. But beneath my calm exterior, the gears in my mind turned. I thought about the envelope, about the man who would walk through those doors before the night was over. The champagne at my table was flat. The bubbles had long gone, but the bitterness remained. I took a slow sip anyway, letting the sharp taste coat my tongue. Around me, the murmur of conversation swelled. Guests laughed, shared inside jokes, clinked their glasses in celebration. I was invisible to them, a forgotten relic tucked out of sight. That was fine. I didn't come here to be seen. I came here to watch. Vanessa thought she had placed me in a cage, that this corner was my punishment. But she didn't realize she had given me something far more valuable. From here, I had the perfect view of her downfall. Every smirk, every smug tilt of her chin, every careless laugh. It was all in my line of sight. And when the moment came, when the seal broke and her world collapsed, I would see every flicker of fear on her face. 2 guests eventually joined my table, a middle-aged couple who glanced at me with polite curiosity. They made small talk about the weather, about the filet mignon being served, about how beautiful the bride looked, but I caught their sideways glances, the whispers they thought I couldn't hear. "Divorced," the woman murmured. "Messy, probably," the man replied. I didn't bother to correct them. Let them wonder. Let them build their own stories about me. The truth would reveal itself soon enough. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands, and let the minutes tick by. My daughter's laughter floated from the head table, mingling with Vanessa's shrill cackle. Guests clapped as the best man raised his glass for a toast. I watched, still as stone, while the fuse burned quietly beneath the surface. Because the truth was, this wasn't Vanessa's victory lap. It was her countdown. She thought the corner was my prison. She didn't realize it was my vantage point. I remembered my father's words like they were carved into the walls of his old study. People will tell you who they are if you give them the right opportunity. That sentence floated back to me now, as I sat at the lonely table in the corner of the reception hall. His voice, gravelly and steady, cut through the clinking glasses and shallow laughter surrounding me. I had heard it once, years ago, when the house smelled of cigar smoke and bourbon. Back then, I didn't know he was speaking about Vanessa. Or maybe I did, deep down, but I wasn't ready to face it. My father never wasted words, and when he dropped that line across the chessboard one winter evening, I thought he was just musing about business rivals or old war stories. I didn't realize he was handing me a prophecy. Vanessa had always been curious about his affairs. Too curious. I could see it clearly now, though at the time I brushed it aside as politeness, maybe even respect. But it wasn't respect. It was calculation. At Sunday dinners in my parents' home, she'd lean forward whenever my father spoke, her eyes narrowing just slightly, like she was trying to memorize each syllable. "What do you mean when you say everything's in order, Mr. Cross?" she once asked, her voice sweet, innocent for anyone else at the table. But I caught the hunger behind it. My father gave her one of his patient smiles, the kind that revealed nothing. "It means exactly what it sounds like, Vanessa. In order." Then he moved his rook across the board and sipped his bourbon. Conversation shifted, but her interest never left. It took me years to understand. The truth came later, after the divorce. After the bitter words and the slammed doors, when the dust of our marriage had settled, but the sting of her disdain still clung to me. That was when the phone rang, 6 months ago, and I heard the voice of Richard Alden, the executor of my father's trust. "The event happens. We move," he said, crisp, without preamble. I had been sitting at my kitchen table, a cup of black coffee cooling at my elbow, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. I frowned at the phone, not sure I had heard him correctly. "What event?" "Remarriage. That is the trigger." His voice was measured, legal, stripped of any warmth. "The documents are airtight. If she remarries, the trust clause activates. My office will conduct a full audit of every asset once held in her temporary care. Any discrepancies convert into legal debt, payable in full, with penalties calculated from the date of misuse." I remember staring at the ring-shaped stain on my table, my mind trying to piece it together. Vanessa, assets, a trust, my father's careful silence. I don't... I don't even know the details, I said. You're telling me— I'm telling you, Richard interrupted, that your father was thorough. He anticipated misuse. He created a condition. If she ever married again, we act. And now she has. The line went dead a minute later, leaving me sitting there with my coffee gone cold and my heart thudding like a hammer. I had thought the divorce was the end, that she had stripped me of dignity enough, walked out with her head high and her hands full, and that my father's memory was only that, a memory. But now I realized he had left me something, not wealth, not property, something sharper. A weapon crafted in silence. Vanessa didn't know it existed. That was the beauty of it. She had once managed part of the family's holdings, back when my father's health was failing. On paper, it looked like convenience, her helping ease the load while I worked long hours in the city. In reality, it was bait. Stocks, small business shares, parcels of land, pieces of a portfolio she thought no one was watching. She had shifted, sold, liquidated, always making sure she benefited more than anyone else. She thought she was clever, careful. She thought that by the time the divorce papers were signed, all of it was dissolved into her own accounts, beyond reach. But my father had known her better than she ever suspected. He built the clause for her like a suit tailored to her flaws. A single line buried in legalese. Upon remarriage, the trustee shall initiate a comprehensive review of all assets previously held in custodianship by Vanessa Hale. That line was a time bomb, waiting. I looked up from my corner table now, across the reception hall, and there she was. Vanessa Hale, or Vanessa Stanton now, perched at the head table with Gregory at her side. She was laughing again, loud and shrill, tossing her hair back as if the chandeliers were stage lights meant for her. She had no idea what she was sitting on. She thought tonight was her grand victory. But I knew better. The trapdoor was already beneath her feet. The air in the hall felt heavy, perfumed with roses and expensive cologne. Plates clattered as servers brought out the next course. Filet mignon with mushroom sauce, artfully arranged with asparagus spears. The guests leaned toward one another, gossip spilling as freely as the wine. I caught fragments, praise for the bride's gown, jokes about Gregory's golf game, murmurs about how Vanessa looked radiant, timeless. Timeless. I nearly laughed at that. Time was her enemy now. I thought of my father's study again, the crackle of the fireplace, the faint creak of the leather chair as he leaned back with his bourbon. The chessboard between us, pieces frozen mid-game. I had been younger then, restless, still believing in patience, in compromise. He had looked at me with those steady eyes, as if he saw the path of my life before I did. "Ethan," he had said, moving a rook with deliberate precision, "there are people who can't help themselves. You don't need to catch them. You only need to give them enough rope." I hadn't understood, not fully. But tonight, I did. I sat back in my chair at the country club, letting the laughter wash over me, the smell of steak mingling with the faint whiff of dish soap from the kitchen doors behind me. Vanessa's voice rose above the crowd, sharp and commanding, pulling every eye toward her. She was still in control, still basking in it. But I knew the truth. The trust clause was already in motion. Richard Alden was already watching the clock. And soon, very soon, those polished double doors at the back of the hall would open. I thought of the text I had received when Vanessa announced her engagement, a forwarded photo from an old colleague, her ring catching the light as she showed it off at a restaurant in New York. I remembered the hollow feeling in my chest, the bitterness that tasted like iron. And then, like an echo, I remembered Richard's words, remarriage. That is the trigger. The fuse had been lit that day. Now it was burning toward its charge, and Vanessa was laughing too loudly to hear it. She thought tonight was the start of her new empire. She didn't see the trap door beneath her feet. The best man's booming laugh echoed through the hall, but I didn't hear a single word of his jokes. My eyes were locked on the double doors at the back of the ballroom, just beyond the arch of flowers and the polished parquet floor. The speeches washed over me like static, meaningless chatter filling the space while I waited for something far heavier. It wasn't the first time I'd been tuned out of a celebration. Years ago, at Vanessa's company holiday party, she'd made me stand by the buffet table while she paraded with her colleagues, pretending I was part of the furniture. I remembered holding a flimsy paper plate, trying to catch her eye while she laughed too loudly at some executive's story. She never glanced my way, not once. Tonight was no different. She had deliberately placed me in the shadows, certain I would remain invisible, a piece of scenery in her grand production. But I wasn't scenery anymore. The laughter at the head table carried across the room, bright and sharp, with Vanessa's voice cutting higher than all the others. She leaned into Gregory, her manicured hand resting on his sleeve, her smile wide enough to flash against the crystal glasses. Every time she tilted her head back, the chandelier light caught the silk of her dress, making her gleam like she was center stage. And in her mind, she was. The best man kept talking about college pranks, about late-night fishing trips, about how everyone knew she was the one. His voice was booming, theatrical, the kind meant for bars and locker rooms. The guests laughed politely, glasses clinking. But Vanessa, she laughed louder. She always had to laugh louder. Every burst of sound from her throat was a claim, a reminder to everyone in the room that she was still the main character. And every so often, her eyes darted back to me. Just for a moment. Just long enough to smirk. I didn't move. My hands stayed folded neatly on the tablecloth, my water untouched, the condensation forming a small ring on the linen. She was checking to make sure I was still where she'd placed me, like a zoo exhibit locked in its cage. And when her eyes confirmed it, she smiled that quiet, mocking smile that said, "See, this is where you belong." But she didn't know what was coming. The maid of honor stood up next, her champagne flute trembling in both hands. Her voice quavered as she began to speak, weaving sweet anecdotes about childhood sleepovers and secrets shared in high school. The crowd softened, leaning in. A ripple of sentimental laughter moved through the tables, followed by polite sighs. But not me. My gaze stayed fixed on the doors. Those heavy double doors were more important than any toast, because I knew that at any moment they would open. And when they did, every eye in the room would shift. Not to the bride, not to Vanessa, but to the man who walked in, carrying the weight of years. The maid of honor's words blurred into one another. Something about loyalty, about how she always knew Vanessa was meant to be loved. I almost scoffed. Loyalty. Vanessa had never been loyal to anyone but herself. And yet, there she sat at the head table, eating up every saccharine word, nodding, smiling, performing. She tapped her glass lightly with her ring, beaming at the crowd like she deserved every ounce of praise. Then it happened. The doors creaked open. It wasn't loud, not at first. Just a faint shift of hinges, barely audible above the speech. But it cut through me like a low chord struck in a quiet room. And even though the maid of honor kept talking, people started to turn. Heads shifted, whispers hushed. It was the kind of sound you couldn't ignore, like an off-key note in a perfect melody. Richard Alden stepped inside. He didn't look like a wedding guest. He didn't look like he belonged in that glittering hall at all. Tall, broad-shouldered, his charcoal suit perfectly cut. He walked with a measured, deliberate pace. No boutonniere, no gift bag, no wedding smile. Just a leather satchel slung over one arm and a thick white envelope clutched in the other hand. Each step drew more attention. Guests leaned aside to get a better look. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. The maid of honor stammered, her words unraveling as her audience evaporated. She glanced at Vanessa, unsure, while Richard moved steadily toward the head table, his polished shoes clicking against the parquet in a rhythm that silenced the room one beat at a time. Vanessa saw him and smiled. Of course she smiled. She tilted her head, that queenly gesture she had perfected over years of practice, and smirked at the approaching stranger. In her mind, this was just another stage cue, another chance to prove she was the center of the universe. She leaned back in her chair, resting a hand lazily on Gregory's sleeve, her chin high. When Richard stopped in front of her, she gave him a polite, almost bored smile. "Can I help you?" she asked, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. Richard didn't smile. He didn't bow, didn't explain. His voice was steady, professional, just loud enough to carry to the crowd. "Vanessa Hale." "Yes," she said immediately, her voice firm, confident. "Date of birth?" She rattled it off without hesitation, without a flicker of doubt. To her, this was still some trivial formality, a caterer's contract, a venue receipt, a minor mix-up. She chuckled, glancing at her friends, milking the moment for attention. Richard slid the envelope from under his arm and extended it. "You've been served." The words dropped like lead into the hall. For a heartbeat, the silence was absolute. The maid of honor froze, her champagne glass trembling in midair. Gregory frowned, leaning in. Guests craned their necks, whispering, confusion spreading like wildfire. Vanessa reached out without hesitation, plucking the envelope from Richard's hand as though it were a bouquet. She even smiled, lifting it slightly for the nearest tables to see. "Guess I'm popular tonight," she called out, and a few guests chuckled politely, though their eyes didn't leave the man who had delivered it. Richard didn't linger. He tapped his tablet once, recording her signature, then turned and walked back the way he had come. His pace was as deliberate leaving as it was arriving. No rush, no fluster. Just business. Vanessa waved the envelope once more before setting it beside her wine glass, laughing as if she had won some small victory. Then she turned back to the maid of honor, gesturing for her to continue, as though nothing more than a menu had just been handed to her. But I didn't watch the speech. I watched the envelope. It sat there, untouched, its sealed flap intact, the faint embossing pressed into the paper like a ghost waiting to be read. I knew what was inside. I knew the weight of it, heavier than any gift in the room, and I knew that the moment she opened it, the temperature of the hall would drop 10 degrees. I folded my hands, leaned back in my chair, and let the seconds stretch. The maid of honor tried to resume, her voice thin, faltering. But the room wasn't listening anymore. Not really. Eyes kept darting toward Vanessa, toward that envelope, toward the possibility of something unscripted. The band, half hidden near the stage, shuffled awkwardly, instruments limp in their hands. The waiters, mid-stride with trays of dessert, slowed, uncertain. Vanessa laughed again, louder this time, trying to pull the attention back. But her fingers betrayed her. Even as she nodded and clapped for the maid of honor's trembling words, her manicured hand kept brushing against the edge of the envelope, tapping it, stroking it, hesitating. Curiosity was her weakness. Always had been. She could never resist knowing what others didn't. She could never wait to be the first in the room to hold the secret. And I knew, with perfect certainty, that she would not be able to leave that envelope sealed. From my corner table, I didn't blink. My eyes stayed locked on her hand, on the way her fingers curled toward the flap. She thought she was untouchable. She thought this was her kingdom. She thought tonight was her victory lap. She signed for it like it was a gift. She didn't know it was her sentence. Vanessa laughed as she slid her nail under the flap of the envelope, thinking it was nothing more than a formality. Her laugh still grated on me after all these years, sharp and theatrical, like she was always performing for an audience that never stopped clapping. She had laughed like that the night she told me to stay home while she attended a charity ball alone, her excuse wrapped in false concern. "You'd be bored, Ethan. This crowd isn't for you." She had laughed when she moved me out of our shared bedroom, claiming she needed more space, and she laughed now, in front of 200 witnesses, as though whatever was in her hands couldn't possibly matter. But I knew what that envelope carried. I knew it was sharper than any blade, heavier than any insult she had ever flung at me. It wasn't a menu, it wasn't a bill, it wasn't some petty oversight from the caterer. It was the weight of years. The ballroom air thickened. The string quartet had fallen silent after the interruption, their bows hovering uselessly. Guests leaned in, whispering behind raised hands, their gazes fixed on the head table. Even the waiters hesitated mid-stride, dessert trays balanced precariously as they lingered against the walls. Vanessa's nail tore through the flap in one smooth motion, like a child unwrapping a gift on Christmas morning. She smiled as she pulled the papers free, her chin high, her voice deliberately careless. "Let's see what we've got here." I could almost taste the anticipation, metallic and sharp on my tongue. She skimmed the first line, and then her smile faltered. It was so slight that most in the room wouldn't have noticed it. The twitch at the corner of her lips, the way her eyes stopped dancing and locked, frozen on the bold black title. But I saw it. From across the room, through the half-blocked view of the column, I saw the exact moment her confidence cracked. Her laughter stuttered, then died. The murmur around the tables grew louder, guests nudging one another, eyebrows lifting. The maid of honor had gone utterly still, her toast forgotten, her glass trembling in her hand. Gregory leaned in toward Vanessa, his brow creased. "What is it?" I could read the words on his lips, though I couldn't hear his voice over the hum of whispers. Vanessa didn't answer him. She turned the page, faster this time, her eyes scanning, her manicured fingers trembling against the paper. Her breath caught, audible enough that the nearest table shifted in their seats. She snapped the packet closed for a moment, clutching it against her chest like she could hide it from the world. But her hand betrayed her again, brushing the flap open, flipping to the second page, then the third. I knew exactly what she was reading. The trust clause, the audit, the penalties, the years of compound interest. Each word like a nail in the coffin she had built for herself. Gregory frowned, reaching for the papers, but she jerked them away, snapping, "It's nothing. Some kind of mix-up." Her voice was brittle, her tone too loud, carrying across the room in a way she hadn't intended. The guests didn't believe her. Neither did Gregory. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands, watching her unravel. For years she had controlled every room she walked into, her smile commanding, her words shaping narratives to suit her. But now the narrative had slipped from her grasp, and she couldn't stop it. Her eyes darted across the hall, desperate, searching, and then they landed on me. It was the first time all night she truly looked at me. Not with contempt, not with smugness, not with dismissal, with fear. The smirk she had carried like a crown all evening was gone. Her face had paled, her skin losing its polished glow. Her posture sagged, shoulders curling inward as though she were trying to fold herself smaller, invisible. But there was no hiding. Not here, not in this hall, not under these lights, not with 200 eyes fixed on her. I took a slow sip of my flat champagne, never breaking eye contact. She flinched, tearing her gaze away as though my silence burned worse than any words could. The murmur in the room grew louder. Guests leaned into one another, whispers carrying phrases that reached me in fragments. Legal papers, trust, debt. What's happening? The air smelled of roasted meat gone cold, the sharp tang of spilled wine lingering near the head table. Gregory's voice cut through, firm and low, but I still heard it. "Show me." Vanessa clutched the papers tighter, shaking her head. "It's nothing. I told you." But her hands betrayed her again, trembling so violently that the bracelet around her wrist clinked against her water glass. The sound was tiny, but in the silence of that moment, it was deafening. I watched her crumble, piece by piece, the mask slipping faster than she could hold it. For years, Vanessa Hale had played the queen, graceful, powerful, untouchable. Tonight, with her second husband by her side, she thought she was invincible. But the truth was laid bare in her shaking fingers and pale face. She wasn't a queen. She wasn't invincible. She was cornered prey, clutching papers that spelled out her ruin. And I savored every second. For the first time in years, Vanessa didn't look like the queen of the room. She looked like prey. The scrape of Gregory Stanton's chair against the polished floor cut through the silence sharper than any word. It was the kind of sound that made people stop breathing for a second, like the world itself had tilted off balance. I watched his hands grip the edge of the table, knuckles whitening as he pushed himself up. His jaw was set, his shoulders squared, his eyes locked on the man who had delivered the envelope minutes earlier. Richard Alden, standing like a sentinel near the back wall. The sight triggered a memory so vivid it nearly pulled me out of the room. Years ago, when Vanessa told me she wanted a divorce, the only thing I had heard louder than her words was the sound of her packing boxes, cardboard scraping against hardwood, the sharp slam of drawers. That scrape had carried finality, the end of a chapter I hadn't even realized was finished. Tonight, it was different. Tonight, the scrape wasn't the end for me. It was the end for her. Gregory's polished shoes clicked in steady rhythm as he walked away from the head table, weaving between the rows of round tables. 200 pairs of eyes followed him, whispers sparking like static in his wake. He didn't acknowledge them. He didn't glance at the bride. He didn't even pause when Vanessa reached out a trembling hand, her voice brittle, desperate. "Gregory, wait." He didn't. Instead, he marched straight toward Richard, whose expression hadn't changed since the moment he walked in. Calm, detached, professional, as though he were standing in a courtroom rather than the glittering ballroom of a country club. Gregory stopped inches from him, close enough that I could see the tautness in his shoulders from across the hall. Their voices were low, but the tension carried, thick and unmistakable. "What is this?" Gregory demanded. Richard's response was clipped, precise. "A trust audit, Mr. Stanton, triggered by remarriage, as stipulated by the late Mr. Cross. The documents are binding, enforceable under Connecticut law." Gregory's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. He asked another question, his tone sharp, incredulous. Richard nodded once, crisp and final, the kind of nod that closed doors and signed verdicts. The weight of it sank into Gregory's stance. His shoulders stiffened, his back straightened, his jaw clenched harder. I could almost see the bricks being laid on him, one after another, as the truth settled in. He didn't return to Vanessa immediately. He lingered, staring at the floor, breathing slowly through his nose. The guests shifted uneasily, forks clattering against plates, whispers running like wildfire. Vanessa sat frozen at the head table, clutching the envelope as if hiding it might erase it. Her skin looked drained under the chandeliers, her lips parted but voiceless. Finally, Gregory turned and walked back. But he didn't sit down. He stopped behind his chair, towering over her. His right hand reached for the gold band around his finger. He twisted it once, then slid it free. The movement was deliberate, slow, final. I knew that feeling too well. The weight of a ring lifted, the indent still pressed into the skin, the symbolic severing of vows. Except when it had happened to me, Vanessa had smirked. Tonight, she looked like she was drowning. Gregory held the band for a beat, staring at it like it was the last lie he had swallowed. Then he placed it gently on the white linen in front of her. He didn't throw it. He didn't slam it. He set it down with such quiet certainty that the faint metallic click against the tablecloth sounded like a gunshot. 200 people gasped in unison. Vanessa's eyes widened, her hand hovering as though she could snatch the ring back before the sound settled. Her lips moved, forming a wordless plea. But Gregory's voice cut through, flat and irrevocable. "We're done here." The silence that followed was total. Even the band stopped fidgeting. Even the waiters froze, trays trembling in their hands. The only sound in the hall was the ragged rhythm of Vanessa's breath. I leaned forward slightly, my heart steady, my pulse calm. I had imagined many endings to her games, but I hadn't imagined how satisfying it would be to see another man deliver the sentence for me. Gasps rippled through the tables. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Someone else muttered, "Did you hear that?" A nervous laugh broke out at the back, then died instantly. At the head table, Vanessa reached out, her hand trembling. "Gregory, please." He didn't even look at her. He turned and walked away, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with a rhythm that sounded like nails being driven into a coffin. He didn't stop for her. He didn't stop for the guests who leaned aside to watch. He didn't stop for anyone. The doors opened again, and Gregory vanished into the night, leaving Vanessa alone, ringless, under the suffocating heat of 200 stairs. I exhaled slowly, a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For the first time in years, I felt the scales balance. Vanessa sat frozen, clutching the papers, her chest heaving, her eyes darting from face to face as if searching for an escape. But there was none. Not here. Not now. The maid of honor half rose from her chair, uncertain. But no one moved to fill the chasm that had opened. Not a single guest rushed to Vanessa's side. The empire she had built on charm and manipulation had collapsed in a matter of minutes, and I was watching every brick fall. The ring made the faintest sound when it hit the linen, but in that moment, it was deafening. By Monday morning, the story wasn't just at the country club. It was on every porch and office coffee pot in Greenwich. That didn't surprise me. In this town, gossip traveled faster than any official record. A scandal like Vanessa's couldn't be contained inside 4 ballroom walls, not when 200 people had seen her second marriage collapse in real time. Every one of those guests had gone home buzzing with the tale, and by dawn, the story had already mutated, retold with embellishments, carried like sparks on the wind. I sat at a diner on Greenwich Avenue, the kind of place that served black coffee and chipped mugs and eggs over easy on paper plates. It was the opposite of the polished country club where Vanessa had staged her grand performance. The locals gathered in booths, leaning over formica tables, voices low but urgent. I didn't have to strain to hear. Her name floated from every corner. Walked out right in front of her. Papers on the table, something about money. Poor girl, the daughter. Imagine her wedding ruined like that. Some stories exaggerated. The envelope was rumored to have contained a restraining order, a bankruptcy notice, even a federal indictment. Others pared it down to something simpler. Vanessa Hale, radiant in her $9,000 gown, abandoned at the altar by a man who realized too late who he had married. But every version ended the same. She was humiliated. I stirred my coffee slowly, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. For years, she had cared about nothing more than appearances. She thought she could weaponize reputation, that the crowd would always side with her. That power came from how loudly she laughed and how many people followed her lead. Now, those same people were tearing her apart over bagels and lattes, and I didn't have to say a word. By Tuesday, the fallout was official. The annulment was filed before the ink on their marriage license had fully dried. Gregory Stanton didn't drag his feet, didn't hesitate. He erased her as quickly as he had married her, his lawyers moving with surgical precision. Word spread that he hadn't even gone back for his things, that he had walked away from her entirely, no backward glance. Vanessa, for all her theatrics, couldn't spin that. I heard it again at the hardware store when I stopped in for nails. The cashier, a kid barely out of high school, leaned toward his coworker. "Did you hear about that country club wedding?" Stanton bailed, like, immediately. "Can you imagine?" They laughed, shaking their heads, never realizing the man buying nails was the one she had tried to bury years ago. The gossip was relentless. By Wednesday, her personal accounts were frozen. I knew because Richard Alden called me, not to gloat, not even to update me as a courtesy, but as a matter of procedure. "We've filed the first wave of documents. Her assets are under review. She'll have access to a limited stipend for essential expenses only." Essential, I repeated, almost tasting the irony. Vanessa had never understood that word. For her, essential meant a new clutch for a luncheon, a bottle of Bordeaux for a casual dinner, a monthly facial at a spa in Manhattan. Now, essential would mean something far different. Rent, utilities, groceries. The silence on the other end of the line told me Richard understood too. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. By Thursday, the social fallout was complete. Her phone, once a chorus of invitations and affirmations, went quiet. The women who had orbited her at luncheons stopped calling. The couples who had invited her to wine tastings and charity events suddenly had family matters to attend to. Even the florist who had decorated her reception whispered to a client in line, You didn't hear it from me, but that wedding was a disaster. She had built her empire on borrowed loyalty, and the second the foundation cracked, the walls fell in. I imagined her sitting in that sleek kitchen of hers, the marble countertops cold against her hands, her phone silent on the island. She'd scroll through her contacts, desperate for someone to answer, to reassure her, to tell her it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But the silence would stretch on. One by one, the people she thought she commanded would vanish, unwilling to stand near the fire. On Friday night, my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in years. At first, I didn't recognize it. I stared at the glowing digits, wondering who would be calling so late. Then the text came through, and my chest tightened. This was you, wasn't it? No name, no greeting, just that. I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to savor the weight of it. The mixture of accusation and reluctant admiration curled into those 6 words. She didn't ask if I knew what was happening. She asked if it was me. Because in her mind, I was the only one capable of orchestrating something so perfectly timed, so thoroughly dismantling. I set the phone down without answering. Not because I wanted her to wonder. She didn't wonder. She already knew. My silence was just the final punctuation mark. That weekend, the local paper ran a piece under the society column, carefully worded, but the subtext was clear. The highly anticipated wedding of Vanessa Hale and Gregory Stanton ended abruptly, sources confirm, with annulment proceedings already underway. The article didn't mention the trust or the legal documents, but it didn't have to. The headline itself was enough to cement the scandal. I clipped the article and slid it into a drawer. Not as a trophy. No, I didn't need one. It was a reminder. Proof that my father's foresight had landed with precision. Proof that silence, patience, and truth had more power than any of Vanessa's laughs or smirks. The next week, I heard the whispers everywhere, at the gas station, in the aisles of the grocery store, outside the church on Sunday morning. Some people pitied her, some mocked her, most just relished the spectacle. But no one defended her. No one said she was misunderstood. And that told me everything. Her empire wasn't just crumbling, it was ashes. I sat in my kitchen one night, the light above the table dim, the clock ticking steady on the wall. My daughter had called earlier, her voice quiet, uncertain. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry about what had happened. But I could hear the conflict in her tone, the way she tried to reconcile her love for her mother with the spectacle she had witnessed. I don't understand, she said softly. You don't have to, I told her. Some things collapse because they were built on sand. There was silence on the line. Then she whispered, I love you, Dad, before hanging up. That was enough for me. Vanessa's downfall wasn't my victory parade. It wasn't fireworks or champagne. It was a slow, steady implosion, a queen reduced to ashes while the world watched. And I didn't need to lift a finger. The text on my phone sat unanswered. Her crown was gone. Her throne had burned. And all that remained was the silence that followed. I didn't answer. Silence was its own reply. It was late winter when I spotted Vanessa again. Crossing a gray grocery store parking lot under a sky too heavy to hold itself up. Snow hadn't fallen in weeks, but the ground was still littered with salt grit and patches of ice, the kind that stuck to the soles of your boots and crunched under every step. My trunk was half open, a bag of groceries perched on the edge, when I caught sight of her. For a moment, I didn't recognize her. Her stride had slowed. There was no entourage trailing behind her, no gaggle of friends in designer coats, no expensive car idling nearby with the heater running. Just Vanessa Hale, wrapped in a faded gray coat that looked like it had seen better days, her hair pulled back without the glossy finish she once demanded. She carried a single bag pressed to her chest, her arms stiff as though each step required effort. I remembered the last time I had seen her before that night. She had been radiant in silk, her laughter ricocheting across chandeliers, her smirk aimed like a weapon across the room. She had walked with the confidence of a queen. Now she looked smaller somehow, like the cold air had hollowed her out. She noticed me before I could look away. For a second, I thought she might pretend not to see me. That had been her weapon of choice in the past, erasing me with deliberate indifference, acting as though I were invisible even when standing inches away. But she didn't. She changed course, her boots crunching over the grit as she cut across the lot. I closed the trunk slowly, the sound echoing in the cold. When she stopped a few feet away, I expected the usual armor. A sharp remark, a deflection, maybe even the faint smirk she used to wield like a crown. But her face carried none of that. There was no arrogance, no triumph, just something quieter, heavier. He planned this, didn't he? Your father. Her voice wasn't accusatory. It wasn't sharp or defensive. It was almost resigned, as though the words had been sitting on her tongue for months, and she had finally given up trying to hold them back. I didn't answer right away. The wind cut across the lot, tugging at the hem of my coat, rattling a stray shopping cart against the curb. I studied her face, the lines sharper now, the eyes less certain. She looked like someone who had been carrying a weight too heavy for too long. I closed the trunk fully and met her gaze. He just knew you. The words came out steady, simple, the truth in its plainest form. Vanessa flinched, not from anger, but from recognition, like she had always known that answer, deep down, and hearing it aloud stripped away her last illusion. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The parking lot hummed with the low roar of traffic from the highway beyond, the occasional squeak of cartwheels, the crunch of boots against frozen gravel. The air smelled faintly of exhaust and melting snow. I thought back to all the times she had underestimated my father, how she had leaned too close at dinners, how she had pried with that bright smile, thinking she could outmaneuver a man who had built his life on foresight and patience. She thought she was clever, hiding her moves in shadows, shifting assets while no one watched. But he had seen her coming all along. And now, here she was, stripped of the power she had spent decades clawing for. She hugged the grocery bag tighter against her chest. I didn't think. She stopped herself, the words dissolving into the frosty air. Her eyes darted away, toward the rows of cars, as if searching for an exit even now. I thought I had more time. Time. That had always been her illusion. She thought she could outrun consequence forever, that the years would bury her mistakes, that no one would ever hold her accountable. My father had been patient enough to prove her wrong. You had years, I said quietly. Her lips parted like she wanted to argue, but no words came. She looked down at the salt-streaked pavement, blinking fast. For a second, I thought I saw tears gather in the corners of her eyes, but the wind whisked them away before they could fall. I wasn't cruel enough to enjoy it, not anymore. What I felt standing there wasn't triumph. It wasn't even relief. It was inevitability. The wheel had turned, slowly but surely, and now she stood on the other side of it. I didn't come here to fight, Ethan, she said finally, her voice thin. I know, I replied. We stood there in silence for a heartbeat longer, two people who had once shared a home, a life, a daughter, now reduced to strangers in a parking lot. The distance between us wasn't just measured in feet. It was measured in years of disdain, in choices that couldn't be undone, in a trust clause signed long before she ever imagined a second wedding. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of gasoline from a nearby pump. Vanessa shifted her weight, clutching the grocery bag tighter, her knuckles pale. She looked older than she should have at her age, worn down by months of isolation, scandal, and fear. I thought of the guests at the country club, their gasps echoing when Gregory Stanton slid the ring off his finger. I thought of the gossip at the cafe, the hushed voices at the hardware store, the headlines in the society column. All of it had converged into this moment, into this woman standing small against the rows of cars, her empire reduced to dust. You'll survive, I said finally. Her eyes flicked back to mine, sharp for just a second. The old Vanessa, the fighter trying to claw her way back. but the look faded almost as quickly as it came. She nodded once, the motion stiff, and turned away. I didn't stop her. She walked back across the lot, her boots crunching, her coat pulled tight against the wind. She didn't look back. I slid into my car, started the engine, and sat for a moment as the heater sputtered to life. Through the windshield, I saw her reach her car, fumble with the keys, and slip inside. The engine coughed, then caught. She drove off slowly, disappearing into the stream of traffic. As I pulled away myself, I thought of my father again. Not in the way you think of someone you miss, but in the way you think of someone whose hand still lingers on the board, guiding the final moves of a game he set in motion years before. She stood small against the rows of cars as I drove away, knowing the war was over, and she had lost. I sat in my father's study years later, the unfinished chessboard still waiting for the next move. The room hadn't changed much since he was alive. The same heavy curtains hung in the windows. The same shelves sagged under the weight of books whose spines had faded with time. The scent of old leather and cigar smoke still lingered faintly, as though the air itself refused to let him go. Dust motes floated lazily in the golden light spilling across the desk, catching on the edges of the chess pieces frozen in mid-game. I reached out and ran my finger along the smooth curve of the knight, the piece I hadn't moved that night all those years ago. My father had leaned back in his chair with a glass of bourbon in his hand, the fire crackling behind him, and said words that had only grown heavier with time. People will tell you who they are if you give them the right opportunity. Back then I didn't understand the full weight of it. Now sitting here after everything that had happened, I realized those words weren't advice. They were prophecy. I thought about the reception hall, the chandeliers, the music that had sputtered out when Richard Alden walked in with that envelope. I remembered the way Vanessa's laughter had filled the room, bright and shrill, until the papers cut through her facade. I remembered Gregory Stanton sliding the ring off his finger, placing it on the table with quiet finality, his words ringing through the hall. "We're done here." I remembered the silence that followed. 200 people watching her world collapse, and I remembered the parking lot months later when I saw her again. She wasn't the queen of the room anymore. She wasn't radiant in silk. She was a woman weighed down by consequences, her coat faded, her voice small. She had asked me if my father planned it all. She already knew the answer. The house creaked around me as I leaned back in the chair, letting the memories settle. It wasn't triumph I felt. Not anymore. It was something steadier, something deeper. Justice. Vanessa's downfall hadn't been about vengeance. It hadn't been about me proving her wrong or watching her burn. It had been about balance, about a truth so sharp it couldn't be buried, no matter how much she laughed or how high she climbed. She thought she could escape the weight of her choices, but my father had ensured she couldn't. His last move had been patient, deliberate, precise, and I had been there to watch it land. I picked up the knight and rolled it between my fingers, the smooth wood warm from my touch. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, filling the silence. My coffee sat cooling on the desk, the steam curling faintly in the light. For years, Vanessa had told me I wasn't enough, that I lacked ambition, that I should be grateful for the scraps of her approval. She had tried to erase me, to paint me as small and forgettable. But the truth was, I had something she could never grasp. Patience. The kind of patience my father had instilled in me. The kind that waits for the exact right moment to act. Patience had been my weapon. Silence had been my shield. And in the end, both had been sharper than any words she could throw at me. I thought of my daughter, how she had looked that night in her wedding gown, radiant and confused as the chaos unfolded. She hadn't asked me for explanations afterward, but I saw it in her eyes, the realization that her mother wasn't who she thought she was, and that her father, quiet and overlooked, had been far stronger than she ever knew. That was enough for me. I set the knight down and reached for the rook. My father's rook. I moved it forward, completing the move he had started years ago. The click of the wood against the board echoed in the quiet room, small but final. The board was finished. The game complete. I sat back and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The world outside the window was quiet, snow falling softly over the yard. The branches of the oak tree swayed gently in the wind, its shadow stretching across the grass like a sentinel. I thought of Vanessa then, not with anger, not with pity, just with clarity. She had built her life on arrogance, on disrespect, on the belief that she was untouchable. And she had fallen exactly the way people like her always do, loudly, publicly, permanently. Some lines once crossed can never be uncrossed. I sipped my coffee, bitter and strong, and let the silence settle around me. The board was finally settled, and so was I.